How do we begin to feel more alive? Hey friends, I'm Dr. Kori Propst, the ground zero health psychologist committed to helping you rebuild your powerful life. And I'm the creator of the Mental Edge Academy. In this first video of this 5-video series, we're going to be exploring the concept of self-awareness. How do we feel more alive? It starts with self-awareness. What can happen if we don't begin building that foundation of self-awareness? I want to talk with you about that today. Now, without self-awareness, we run the risk of some pretty detrimental things happening in our lives, okay? First of all, we run the risk of our immediate thoughts and our immediate emotions and those feelings running our lives. And that's literally, guys, how most of us go through life, being run by our emotions and our thoughts, as opposed to recognizing that we have emotions and that we have thoughts. We literally become them. Notice how you explain the thoughts and explain when you're experiencing an emotion. It's, I'm angry, or it's, I'm depressed, or I'm so confused. We literally fuse with the emotion when we say, I am, instead of recognizing, oh, I'm having an emotion here. I'm having this sense of, or this experience of downness, or discouragement, or sadness, or anger. So when we're not learning how to build self-awareness, we literally run the risk of ignorant living as opposed to intentional and mindful living. The second thing to consider is that when we're not self-aware or learning self-awareness or practicing self-awareness, we can get into pretty destructive relationships, and then secondary to that, we can stay in them for a much longer period of time. We get wrapped up in the dynamic because we don't really understand what's happening. We don't really understand what our part in it is, and we don't necessarily have the tools to be able to ask those questions in a real generative way, okay? The third thing is that we could end up hurting others unnecessarily. You may find that you get into relationships and you're just finding that there's this perpetual sense of conflict. And add to that what we may find is we keep apologizing for things all the time. You may find that that's a pattern in your life, a pattern of behavior. So we end up repeating negative patterns of behavior over and over and over again. Without self-awareness, we don't have the questions to be able to ask, what is going on here? Why is this happening? All right. Another thing is that we may find ourselves adopting the habits, the principles, the values, the belief systems, the attitudes, the goals of other people, because we don't and haven't explored what ours are and why we feel that way and what's important to us, okay? Another very important piece of self-awareness is getting in touch with the strategies that we use to protect ourselves. In what sorts of situations do we defend ourselves, right? In what sorts of situations do we hide? We adopt emotional avoidance strategies such as overwork, perfectionism, alcohol or drug abuse, disordered eating, or even self-harm sorts of activities. And when we can begin to understand ourselves better, the potential for us to move into and stay in those sorts of behaviors declines, all right? The other thing is that we can really become stuck in the grips of old beliefs. We when we're young, we tend to adopt messages from people who were important to us, from our caregivers, from people who took care of us. And not a lot of those messages were positive or generative or move us, prompt us to behave in positive, authentic ways. Okay, so with self-awareness, what we can do is we can get underneath those and understand what our biases are, our tendencies and ways of being, understand what our opinions are and where they come from, so that they don't necessarily have to guide our behavior. Here's a very practical example. I know a lot of people who end up in and staying in very dead-end jobs, okay, because they're scared that there may be nothing else for them. And you dig underneath and you peel back the layers, and this can have a lot to do with other fears. Fears of being inadequate, fears of being incompetent, fears of just general worth. And we'd never really get down there unless we're willing to engage in a process of and a practice of self-awareness, right? Some other things. We don't recognize or take ownership of both our strengths and our weaknesses. So those with a very low level of self-awareness can't necessarily describe incredibly well what both of those are for themselves. Or maybe they can describe them, but it seems kind of superficial. And they can't maybe necessarily describe how in different contexts these strengths and weaknesses come out to play, okay? Now, we also, when we're not engaged in a process of self-awareness, can't communicate our needs very clearly, nor do we have a broader perspective of others' needs. And it's a lot of times because we haven't explored what our needs are. We haven't actually asked the difficult questions and wrestled with those questions and sat with those questions. Okay? A lot of times with a lack of self-awareness, others' needs become our needs because we haven't reflected. There hasn't been that sense of introspection. And it can't just be one question, guys. Many of you have probably heard of the Socratic method. It's a layered method. We ask one question, and then we ask a question about that question, and then we ask a question about that question in order to really get deep. Okay? Self-awareness does not mean a superficial, well, this is the way I am. No, it's not. There's a lot more breadth and depth to it. Another thing, guys, without self-awareness, we will rarely be able to create meaningful, long-lasting, enduring changes in our lives because we don't necessarily understand what's happening, what's guiding our behavior. You know, I have a lot of clients who I work with who they may be able to list the pros and cons of doing a behavior, but they can't list the pros and cons of not doing the behavior. Again, we're getting down to more layers. We have competing commitments in our lives. Things that we think wouldn't influence us often do. And without self-awareness, we just can't understand those or get to them. So guys, you know, especially in the big areas of life, like our emotional life and our careers and our vocation, our relationships, self-awareness is a game changer, okay? It's a primary pillar of well-being. So, join me tomorrow where I'm going to be sharing with you a very personal story that kind of rocked my world and really led me to one big question that I started asking myself regularly for greater self-awareness. Thanks, guys.